Hey guys, Mark Law of Rational Wine, Consult Wine, 7 Key Wine Concepts. In this video, I will be discussing vintages in relation to wine. When you go and pick up a bottle of wine, there are three pieces of information that you'll usually find on the label. First, you'll see its origin, where the wine comes from. Secondly, you'll see the grape variety that it's made from. Finally, you'll see a vintage year printed on the label. And in this case, this comes from the Barossa Valley region in South Australia. It is made from the Shiraz grape, and it comes from the 2012 vintage. The vintage year on the label, this simply represents the year in which the grapes were harvested and finally goes into the wine. And there's a few things you can do with this information. I'll go through them one by one now. Firstly, you can use the vintage year to calculate the age of the wine. This is the simplest way to use it. You just take away the vintage year from the current year. So for example, this was a 2012 vintage wine. It is now the year 2020. You can calculate that this is an 8-year-old bottle of wine. However, rather than getting hung up on a specific age, I think it's more useful to think in terms of age ranges. This is something that most of us are familiar with already. For example, with people. We place people into generational categories. We've got boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. We sense that two people born just 1 year apart are going to have a lot more in common than two people born 10 years apart. Likewise, all things being equal, two wines made in 2 consecutive years are going to be much more similar to each other than two wines made 10 years apart. I recommend using the following age ranges to guide you: 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and 10 years plus. All things being equal, there should not be a dramatic difference between, for example, a 2010 vintage wine and a 2009 vintage wine. It's not like 2010 is perfect and then 2009 is suddenly too old. These are just some guidelines which will help you to navigate. Once you've placed the wine in a particular age range, you can make an educated guess as to the wine's readiness to drink. It can fit into one of 4 categories. The wine can either be too young, it's ready to drink, with potential to age, it's drinking well but don't age it any further, otherwise it's too old, it's past its best. How can a wine be too young? Usually this has to do with the wine's structure. Usually it's the acid is either too sharp or the tannins are too grippy. It's a better idea to let the wine settle in the bottle first to become more approachable. As it reaches that point, the wine will show a lot more balance, but it's still quite young, it's very fruit driven. Not to say that there's no secondary or tertiary characters for complexity, but it's still being masked. That fruit is still quite upfront, so it's ready to drink, but it can age further. Once it ages further though, we start to say that the fruit is dropping out, which gives those secondary and tertiary characters a chance to show themselves. This is where it's on its way to becoming ready to drink and don't age further. Past a certain point, it's going to become too old and past its best. There's no fruit backing up the wine. It might still be pleasant to drink, but you can see that the complexity has gone down. Keep in mind that these are 2 different scales, the age range and the readiness to drink. They're not supposed to be perfectly correlated. They're just guidelines to help you decide how they fit with each other. Not all wines develop in such a linear fashion. There are styles of wines which are just made for drinking right now, and they're not meant for aging. On the other hand, there are wines that even after 5 or 10 years, some people will still consider them too young. With more experience, you will be able to judge for yourself which category that wine will belong to. So you might have noticed that I added the condition all things being equal with what I said before, because in real life, not all things are equal. This brings us to the second reason why the vintage year is important: vintage variation. Simply, this is taking into account the varying weather conditions that happen year to year. Remember that the grapevine needs 4 things to survive and to thrive. It needs sunlight, heat, water, and nutrients. And the weather can influence 3 of those 4 things. If there's not enough sunlight, if the temperatures are too low, it's possible that the grapes will be not ripe, and that's going to translate into the wine as well. And if there's too much sun, if there's too much heat, then the grapes might ripen too quickly, and any wines that are made from those grapes will taste a bit jammy or baked or just imbalance. So there is a perfect theoretical point of ripeness and everything outside of that perfection. So you can imagine, if you're relying on God or Mother Nature, how difficult it is to reach that perfect point. So what's a good vintage? Pretty much the stars align, the weather is fine, there's no disease pressure, the grapes reach a perfect level of ripeness that the winemaker is after. A bad vintage is if it rains at the wrong time, if there's hail that damages the grapes, if the weather is cooler than usual, or the opposite, if there's an unseasonal heat wave, then the grapes can be either underripe or overripe, and you don't have the best material to use to make wines. And other things can go wrong as well. Here, recently, we've got the bushfires, and it doesn't matter how perfect the weather is if your grapes taste like smoke. Another thing to keep in mind is that vintage conditions will vary between locations. The weather in Australia is not going to be the same as the weather in Spain, for example. And this weather in Spain is not going to be the same as the weather in France. And even within the same country, there are differences. In France, you have different weather in Bordeaux versus the Loire Valley versus Burgundy. It's possible to have a good vintage, a great vintage, and a terrible vintage in the same country. Seems obvious, but good to keep in mind. So if not all vintages are the same, how can you know if the bottle you picked up is going to be from a good vintage or a bad vintage? You could read the back of the label and the producer might tell you if it's good or bad, but this relies on a lot of trust. So I can give you 2 answers. The easy answer is do your research. These days there are a lot of professional websites that can track vintage conditions for most of the important regions in the world. 2 sources I often refer to are Berry Brothers and Rudd and The Wine Advocate. I'll leave links in the description below, feel free to check it out if you're interested. Otherwise, if you're looking through a wine list and you see multiple vintages listed of the same wine, the price could give you a clue. Generally, the better vintages are going to be priced higher than the other vintages, but this is not guaranteed. The more complicated answer I can give you is to maybe not worry too much about vintage variations. No matter what the vintage conditions are, the winemaker has to do the very best they can with the material they have to make the highest quality wine possible. And as you get more into wine, you will discover producers who are pretty consistent, regardless of the vintage ratings, because of their experience and their skill in both the vineyard and the winery. To dismiss all of that hard work because of a weather report, I think it seems a bit disrespectful. Excellent vintages are great to have, but poor vintages are wine as well. So that's all I want to talk about. Just a quick recap. Place the wine in a particular age range first to help you to navigate. Next, you can put the wine into one of 4 categories. Too young, drink now with potential to age, drink now, don't age any further, or it's too old, past its best. Next, with the vintage variations, you can either do your research if you're really after the best of the best. Otherwise, I encourage you to be open to trying all wines, regardless of the vintage. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please click like, subscribe, share with your friends. If you have any questions, please send me a message, leave a comment, or send me an email. See you again soon.